Oh hi, what's happening? I wanted to talk about two video games which are on the Nintendo Switch, and they're kind of in the same genre, what they refer to as the Metroidvania genre of video games, and one of them is called Hollow Knight, and the other is called Ori and the Blind Forest. This one's kind of interesting because it's actually a Microsoft game, and after playing them I thought, wow, it would be pretty neat to discuss them both and compare them in different ways using a variety of different categories. So that's what this is, this video here, yeah. So let's start it then. These are two of the most well-known and well-renowned Metroidvania titles of our generation. They look kind of similar on a surface level, but are they in fact similar? They got ghostly, pale main characters, some spooky locations, creepy crawlies, and some sort of dilapidated world. But despite these surface-level similarities, these are two extremely different games. I think it would be somewhat interesting to discuss what these games do well, how each excels in its own way, and the shortcomings of both titles. The first category is visuals. Hollow Knight's visuals are quite excellent. The environments are atmospheric, and some are strikingly beautiful. The entire game has a really interesting style. It's incredibly well crafted given how many environments there are in the game. I think the character animation is another strong point. Each creature inhabiting this world is intricately designed and has its own personality. All of the game's visual accomplishments are made even more impressive when you consider that this is a Kickstarter game with quite a small team of people who worked on it. Ori and the Blind Forest is visually pristine. The environments are wonderfully detailed, and the character animation is strikingly smooth. I've even heard that Moon Studios, the developers, actually improved the game's animations for the Switch release, and it really shows. The main cast of characters are delightfully expressive, which really helps you to empathize with them in the game's story sections. One partial drawback of Ori's naturalistic visuals is that it is at times less readable than something like Hollow Knight. For instance, spiky plants and the like can blend into the environment and be difficult to spot. This applies doubly to playing in handheld on the Switch, where Ori is just a bit too small than what would be ideal. I'll also say that the enemy designs weren't exactly memorable overall, with most just being different variations of blobs. Apart from the minor detractors, which are more nitpicks than anything else, it's one of the most polished looking 2D games I've ever played. It truly is a wonder to behold. The next category is music. Hollow Knight's score is largely atmospheric. In boss battles, there are more intense tracks, but generally speaking, the music is intended to set the mood for each given location. I found this to be effective enough, and tons of the tracks in Hollow Knight are quite memorable and well done. Ori and the Blind Forest music is simply phenomenal. Each track is truly excellent, with the music used during the intense cutscenes being my favorites. Now it is a little unfair to directly compare Ori and Hollow Knight's soundtracks, since Ori's music has the huge advantage of being live recorded. With that said, I personally enjoyed Ori's soundtrack more, even though Hollow Knight's score is also quite good. Now is exploration and progression. First off is Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight is pretty conservative in regards to how it doles out guidance to the player. There's quite a lot to discuss here, so I'll describe the start of the game as a way of introducing the exploration systems. After a brief tutorial section in which we are introduced to the main mechanics of the game, our protagonist, the knight, enters the small town of Dirtmouth. Here we are introduced by the Elderbug to Hallow Nest, a huge society of interconnected tunnels which was once grand but is now abandoned and diseased. The main overarching goal of Hollow Knight is to stop the infection, a mysterious force which has ruined Hallow Nest and made the bugs zombies or something, I guess. Here you descend into the first section of the game, the Forgotten Crossroads. You'll then discover that the knight doesn't actually have a map, and you'll have to rely on your memory to navigate the crossroads, at least for a bit. After not too long, you'll find a trail of papers and a distant humming, which will lead you to Conifer, the mapmaker bug. You can then purchase a map from Conifer, which obviously allows for easier navigation. You are also introduced to Stag Stations, which serves as the game's fast travel system. After you beat the boss of the Forgotten Crossroads, you travel to Greenpath, and as it turns out, you don't have a map for this area either, so you'll have to seek out the help of Conifer yet again. This same cycle of traveling to a new area, finding Conifer, and buying a map continues for pretty much every new area in the game. As you might be able to tell, this system in Hollow Knight means that you will spend some amount of time in each new area without a map. This does have the pretty cool effect of making the world of Hollow Knight feel more mysterious, and you really do feel like you're mapping out an ancient, long-dead bug society. It also becomes less daunting as you go along, as you naturally become more used to the process and proficient at it. In addition to all the other progression mechanics in the game, Hollow Knight, as is expected of all Metroidvania games, has power-ups which allow you to access areas which were previously blocked off. Much later in the game, after a great deal of exploration, the knight obtains a new weapon, the Dream Nail. You are given the objective of finding 3 mystical beings. Each of the 3 are marked on your map, and you'll need to find them all to beat the game. The order in which you complete these objectives is up to you. There tends to be multiple routes to each location, and tons of optional secrets, items, bosses, and even whole areas hidden throughout the tunnels. After you've finally found the spirits of the 3 masked bugs, you'll be allowed entry to the final boss, which you may now beat to complete the game. But there is more. Hollow Knight is one of them games which has multiple endings depending on whether or not you have completed specific tasks, and the game's most basic ending isn't particularly satisfying, and it's pretty clear that there's more still to do. I think that when I first reached the end of the game, my playtime was at about 20 hours, but by the time I had completed everything to unlock the true ending, it was at 30 hours. So this is a substantial amount of post-game content, if you can even call it that. However, I will say that one of my bigger issues with the game is in relation to these post-game objectives. I really had no idea what was required of me to get to the true final boss, so I was kind of forced to look online. I'm sure that if I was a more diligent player who had taken my time, I would have eventually come across the hint I needed to find to send me in the right direction, but in the game as is, it's pretty cryptic regarding what is required, so I just took the easy way out. I know that a major part of Hollow Knight's identity is about allowing the player to discover things for themselves, but when something as important as the true final boss is hidden behind tons of cryptic and unclear objectives, I do take issue. Obviously, this won't bother all players, and some might be satisfied enough with getting the bad ending and stopping, but many won't be. And for those who aren't willing to spend a ton of time exploring around for hints and the like, looking for outside guidance is kind of the only option. I can obviously only represent my personal experience with the game, and I can't help but feel like Hollow Knight was at times simply too cryptic and obtuse for me. With that said, for a majority of the game this wasn't at all the case. Being able to slowly uncover each different facet of Hallownest was incredibly gratifying and unique, and I really do value how nuanced and challenging navigation in Hollow Knight can be. So now that Hollow Knight's navigation is out of the way, let's move on to Ori and the Blind Forest to take on the Metroidvania concept. Ori is, in general, a far more guided experience than Hollow Knight. For one, there's a lengthy prologue to the game, which is several minutes long, and while heavy in terms of emotion, is pretty light in terms of gameplay. You're then let loose into the Blind Forest and find that Ori has constant access to a map of the game's world. This map fills up as you traverse the environment, and Ori's location is always clear thanks to a player icon. There's also map stones which can be picked up and then placed in shrines, which fill in the parts of the map you haven't explored as of yet, and are largely helpful to access secrets. The game leads you through the Blind Forest with large glowing circles on the map screen, which indicate where you have to go to progress. Upon reaching these glowing circles, you'll usually find a dungeon, which you must complete. This is the game's main cycle, which carries on throughout. Ori also has a skill tree system, and while the skills obtained here are all optional, several of them are quite helpful for navigation and finding secrets. One detail I particularly enjoyed is that after you've completed one of the game's pseudo-dungeons, the world itself changes in one way or another. For example, after restoring life to the Ginzo tree, the water in the Blind Forest, which was previously poisonous and deadly to the player, is now clean and can be swam in, which cleverly ties into the themes of the game while also serving the gameplay utility of providing the player with more navigation options. I pretty much never felt lost while playing Ori, and unlike Hollow Knight, the only real incentive for exploration is additional power-ups. This isn't really a problem since Ori and Hollow Knight are so differently structured, but it is notable nonetheless. It means that there is less of an incentive to go off the beaten path. Ori is also much more story-focused than Hollow Knight, and as a result I felt more compelled to move from objective to objective so I could see what happens next in the story than I did to explore my surroundings. I also have to say that the game is incredibly well paced. Ori is comparatively speaking on the shorter side, but it uses this brief length to deliver a really fantastic experience, deftly tying the gameplay and narrative together in incredibly satisfying ways. That's all I really have to say about navigation in Ori. If nothing else, it's certainly more straightforward than in Hollow Knight. This category is combat and movement. I think it would be fair to say that one of Hollow Knight's main focuses is combat. The Knight's Nail is a wonderfully satisfying weapon. Every time you hit an enemy feels great. You can of course jab at things with the nail, but more importantly, you can use it to jump off of enemies. This is a ton of fun, and has so much gameplay utility. What's also great about hitting enemies is that it replenishes the knight's soul, which can then be used to either heal yourself or to unleash offensive spells. The healing mechanic is quite clever, as you have to decide in the heat of battle whether or not you want to leave yourself vulnerable to attacks by charging up the heal move. These core moves are added to throughout the game, and soon enough the knight can dash, wall jump, and double jump. These new options increase the complexity and versatility of the knight and can make battles really satisfying. There are also tons of different collectible charms throughout the game, many of which aid in combat. There's a huge different variety of ones to equip, so there's tons of ways to customize the knight to meet whatever challenge you may be facing. The knight's movement itself is snappy and gets the job done, though I do think it does feel a bit stiff at times, a detail which becomes more noticeable in the few platforming sections the game includes. One late game challenge is particularly brutal, and it does kind of feel like the knight wasn't really designed to be put in these Meat Boy-esque pixel-perfect segments. Despite that, movement is still wonderful overall and works excellently with Hollow Knight's combat-first approach. Interestingly enough, Ori's movement and combat situation is pretty much the inverse of the knight's. Movement itself is incredibly fluid, smooth, and just floaty enough. You're pretty limited at the start, only having a jump, but like Hollow Knight, the game doesn't take long to dole out the upgrades. You're eventually able to glide, double jump, ground pound, and most importantly, bash. The bash is Ori's most unique move, and allows you to catapult yourself off of the environment, enemies, and projectiles. This is where Ori really shines, and it's by far my favorite move in the game. It has so much utility, and is just plain fun to use. What more could you ask for? Unfortunately, the combat in Ori hasn't received nearly as much attention as the platforming, and is pretty lackluster as is. You have very few options, and for most of the game, all you can really do is spam the Y button while near enemies. It's kind of lame and not all that fun, and while you can bash and ground pound enemies for some combat variety, it doesn't do much to fix the problem. There are a few combat upgrades unlockable using the skill tree, but they don't end up improving things much at all. This makes it pretty clear why Ori opts for timed platforming challenges to serve as its climactic moments in the place of traditional boss fights, since I can't imagine they would be all that enjoyable here. The mundane combat is made more acceptable by the fact that Ori doesn't require you to do all that much of it, but it's still a blemish on the game in my view. Wow, this category is about save points and difficulty. I thought I would give a category to specifically talk about both games' implementation of saving and how that correlates to difficulty. In the case of Hollow Knight, benches, which act as the game's save points, aren't too common, with there only being a few per area in general. Fortunately, Hollow Knight doesn't punish death very harshly, as you only lose currency upon each defeat, which can then be collected back from the spirit remnant you leave at the place of your death. These systems work well for a majority of the game, but it did become an irritation at times, specifically when faced with a challenging boss. The issue here is that the bosses in Hollow Knight are across the board pretty hard, so naturally I died a lot to them. This is fine when there's a bench placed near the area, but in several instances the boss I needed to fight was quite a trek from the nearest bench, meaning I'd have to waste tons of time just getting back to fight them again. I really wasn't much of a fan of this, and it made progression feel pretty grating during these moments. I of course did eventually persevere, but I can't help but feel like the game could have been a bit more forthcoming in providing the player with benches, a change which I imagine would have improved my experience with the game substantially. Apart from that, yes, Hollow Knight is hard. There are certain bosses which honestly felt ridiculous the first time I faced them, and many of them took quite a long time to conquer. With that vast difficulty does come an immense feeling of satisfaction once I overcame the hardships, but of course this level of challenge certainly isn't for everyone. There are ways of making the game easier on yourself, mainly the charms you collect throughout, but even then it still puts up quite a fight. And we now arrive at Ori, which is pretty much the reason I wanted to discuss save points in the first place. In Ori, you can use energy points you've collected to deploy a save state at pretty much any time in the game. This is an incredibly cool mechanic and keeps the tougher parts of the game from feeling overwhelming. There are a few exceptions, of course. You can't save in an unsafe area or during one of the game's chase sequences, but apart from that, you have free reign to save whenever you want. I like this far better than the bench system in Hollow Knight, and while obviously both games are very different, I do think that more Metroidvania titles could benefit from this level of flexibility. Looking at the game in the macro sense, it can still be pretty hard. There are some demanding platforming sections which really tested my skills, but everything is still really fun because of the game's phenomenal movement. Ori is a much more approachable game, since for the most part, you really can play it at your own pace, thanks to the save functions. Next up, characters, story, and lore.
Hollow Knight is a pretty prime example of a game which is lore first, story second. Hollow Knight does of course have a story, it's just that the larger focus is on discovering the secrets of the game's world. Hollow Nest is filled to the brim with history, and the game makes great use of environmental storytelling to convey the true depth of the Dead Kingdom. The story of the main game itself is kept fairly vague, and if you aren't paying attention you might miss out on key details. I myself wasn't entirely sure of all that was going on until I did some research on YouTube, and after immersing myself in a simply embarrassing amount of videos, I became quite enthralled with the world of Hollow Knight. I think that while this method of storytelling is really impressive and allows for some fun discoveries, the game's lore is so intricate and detailed that on several occasions I didn't fully understand the implications of some of the events that occurred, which certainly would have had more of an impact had I known what was really going on. This likely wouldn't be a problem if I were to replay the game, and this feeling of being lost wasn't actually all that much of a bad thing, since it left me wanting to learn more. The attention to detail is immensely impressive, and there's a ton to discover. I also want to touch on the characters in Hollow Knight briefly. You meet quite a few different bugs throughout the game, each of which has their own distinct personality. They really help to flesh out the world of Hollow Knight, and since they appear pretty infrequently, it's always a treat to come across one. Ori and the Blind Forest is quite different than Hollow Knight in terms of narrative, since, as I mentioned previously, it's a much more guided experience. There's far more cutscenes, each of which are wonderfully animated and on several occasions pretty heart-wrenching. The story is quite dark, but it never goes too far and includes plenty of emotionally satisfying moments to balance things out. I think one of the biggest differences between my experience with Hollow Knight and my experience with Ori is that in Ori I was always progressing so that I could get to the next story section, whereas in Hollow Knight I tended to be progressing so I could see more of the world. Hollow Knight, by comparison, does have some great story moments, but I didn't find any nearly as emotionally resonant as the stuff that's in Ori. And as I already said, the music in Ori does a phenomenal job of accentuating these key moments. Ori also has far less of a focus on lore and environmental storytelling. It's there certainly, but it's not at the forefront. The characters are another way in which Ori is quite different from Hollow Knight, with there being a smaller but more well-developed cast.
And now, length and content.
So as it may have become evident, Hollow Knight is a game where you have a lot of different things to do. There's the main story, of course, but then there's a huge amount of completely optional content peppered throughout the game. I really enjoyed the sheer scope of it all, which is made even more impressive when you consider this game cost $15 and was made by such a small team of people. The developers also added tons of new stuff to the game after launch, and while I won't discuss everything that was put in, suffice to say that there's a lot. They even added a whole new boss rush mode for players seeking even more of a challenge, which I did not even attempt because I knew I didn't stand a chance. The ratio of price to content in Hollow Knight is actually kind of insane. There's an unbelievable amount stuffed into a $15 package. Ori is a pretty different situation from Hollow Knight in reference to length and content. There is certainly less, and the game is $5 more expensive, but it's also much more compact and streamlined. I beat Ori in about 7 hours, and while that is dwarfed by the 35 I spent with Hollow Knight, I'm still really satisfied with my experience. There's also less additional content than in Hollow Knight, but if you were to pursue it, I'm sure it would boost your playtime by a few hours. Ori does come out looking a bit short when compared to Hollow Knight, but that's really only because Hollow Knight is simply unprecedented in its vast amount of content.
So yes, that is all of my opinions on the various different aspects of these two tangentially related video games.
In most ways, I think that I would say Hollow Knight is the better game. It's more unique, more ambitious, and the lore is really, really fun to delve into. Ori, on the other hand, is far more standard, but is so well polished and wonderful that I wouldn't ignore it either. Both games are great is the main idea of this video, I guess. Maybe, yeah.
So if you're looking to play a fun Metroidvania type thing, either one of these games would be a great candidate. So that is all for this topic. I hope that I was able to communicate my thoughts on these games reasonably well. Okay then, see you later, I guess.